Hey folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. Today we have none other than the illustrious Tyler Roberts on the show today. What's up, Tyler?
What's up?
So today we're talking about Microsoft 365 attacks. And this is going to be a series of episodes where we're going to be talking about different types of attacks against Microsoft 365 specifically. So for this one, we're talking about the latest trends and techniques for enumerating Microsoft 365 and kind of the enumeration attacks like users and endpoints and things like that. And Tyler and we're going to talk about how attackers might identify M365 tenants, how to discover and validate accounts, what you need to know as an IT admin to protect your organization, what you can do about some of these things, some of the things you can't do much about, but it's good to know what's out there. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And yeah, I'm looking forward to it, Tyler. Are you excited?
Super excited.
Awesome.
Always love talking about enumeration.
Yeah, and for those listening in or watching on YouTube, I've adjusted my lighting. So let me know what you think. I'm still working on my Network Chuck kind of like professional lighting setup. And that's who I aspire to get my camera set up looking like, because I love his like hair light. He must have like a snoot and he's got like a nice backdrop. So I've got a ways to go to get there. But anyways, enumeration. Tyler, what is enumeration? Why do we care? Why is it an important part of the pen testing process, the hacking process? What's enumeration? What do we think about when it comes to enumeration?
So I think in the simplest term possible, enumeration is the exploration of different assets and the gathering of information from said assets. So it's really just, going out, discovering things and knowing everything you can about that asset by enumerating information from it. So just that process of gathering information.
Yeah. And that's a key part of a good pen test methodology, right? Is enumeration. You hear it all the time in, like OSCP studying and, security courses. And especially when it comes to pen testing, offensive security, you'll hear enumeration all the time. And so many times we've gone through enumeration processes once, we've gone through it twice, we've gone through it the third time. And then that third time we're like, oh, there's this thing over here. Like maybe we should poke at that. That happens to me all the time on internals. I'm sure it happens to you, but like I'll do my enumeration and I'll look at things again and I'll be like, oh, that's interesting. And then I'll come back to it and I'll review it. And I find things that I didn't find the first couple of times. And enumeration is so important to a good pen testing methodology. So were you going to say something about that?
Yeah, I was going to say it's so key to us on both internals and externals that we usually dedicate an entire day of a penetration test engagement to it, because gathering as much information as you can makes your attack surface bigger, which makes your probability of successful attacks, exploits, things of that nature higher. So enumeration is very key in all types of penetration testing to just know more about your target, what you're attacking, and exploring those avenues for attack.
Yep. And we're going to talk about goals in a minute. But a goal of mine is like, I want to know that environment as well as the sysadmins know it, if not better. Right. And a lot of times it's a cyclical process. And some of you may have heard that before, is you do some enumeration, you do some recon, you look at things, and then you move on to the next step, right? You might exploit something, you might find some other thing to kind of target. And then you do more enumeration and more recon, and then you exploit, or you move laterally, and then you do more enumeration. So it's one of those things that's like a constant in a pen testing offensive security methodology. Is enumeration is found in like every phase. It's like you do a thing, enumerate, do another thing, enumerate. And kind of the same thing goes for externals as well.
Yep. Enumerate for those hosts. And then once you have those hosts, you need to enumerate endpoints and, software running on those. And then you need to cross-reference all that data and just, it never stops.
Yep, exactly. So specifically talking about Microsoft 365, Tyler, what are the goals for enumerating Microsoft 365? Like when we talk about this, what are we looking for from an attack perspective? What are we trying to get? What information do we need? What's helpful? And where do we go from there?
Yeah, so I think the most pivotal information is going to be emails and account information, which there's various tools that you can enumerate that from. And then also tenant information, because once you have tenant information, you can find various different things like domains that are associated with that tenant that might be additional avenues for attack.
Yeah, exactly. And the interesting thing with tenants is, and I'm curious on your perspective of this, how many times are tenant names different? Like they have, you do your AAD internals, which we're going to talk about. You do your tenant enumeration and things like that. And how often do you find where there's tenant names or domain names that are not super similar that you might not have found otherwise if you didn't have the ability to enumerate the tenants in Microsoft 365?
Say probably 70% of the time you find additional information you wouldn't have found otherwise that, proves to be useful.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's key because even though it's just a tenant name or a domain name, that might be some development tenant or that might be some other website or some other organization even or another company that is, a child company or a sister company that you might be in scope for that engagement that you might be able to target, right? And that information might not have been disclosed by the organization, right? Maybe they were going for a black box test and they just provide you a little bit of information or whatever. So that's super helpful,
100%, because I can help find additional hosts. And on the topic of enumeration, I think another thing that's pivotal outside of tenant names and host names is IPs. Majority of the time we see organizations, instead of listing out an entire subnet, they'll give you specific IPs. And another thing you can use to enumerate additional information is ARIN. And you can go plug those IPs into ARIN. You can find entire net blocks, and some of the IPs in those net blocks that they didn't provide you, actually have things running on them, or various things like that. Additional avenues for attack can be discovered on those. So
yeah. Now let's talk about accounts a little bit. Obviously that's a big important thing. That's right. That's what we use to spray passwords with or brute force and things like that. So walk me through kind of accounts, what accounts you're looking for, account formats. I know we're going to talk about some of the specific tools, but I think account format is something that comes up time and time again. I think just this week, you're dealing with an issue where it's like first name dot last name is a bit harder to enumerate than, at first name, last name or something like that, or first initial, first name, last name and things like that. So there's some complications or some inefficiencies, right, with enumerating different types of account formats, right, Tyler?
Right. So the shorter or the less permutations you have, the easier it is to enumerate. So if you're doing an email format like first initial last name, then you only have 25 total permutations per last name, versus if you're doing first name dot last name, you have, millions of different permutations, because there's not just a subset of 25 first names that you're permutating with the last names. There's like, 15,000 different first names. And so you end up with a list around like 14 million for first dot last, versus a list of, maybe 1 million with first initial last name. And then in the case that you're an organization that just uses first name, that's even quicker to enumerate, because you only have, a substantially smaller list of first names that, you're trying against.
Yep. Yeah. So recapping on goals for enumerating Microsoft 365, right, is 1, discovering tenants, 2, discovering accounts, right, emails, usernames, and the formats for those. And the third thing, right, Tyler, is validating those accounts, right? What's a kind of, and this kind of gets into tools maybe, and that's fine, but what's kind of a high level process? Like how are threat actors going to be validating those accounts?
Yeah, so accounts can get validated using the Graph API, the Microsoft Graph API. So if you've ever authenticated to Microsoft, it's important to know what type of tenant you're dealing with, whether it's managed or federated, because that changes the way that you're going to enumerate. If you're in a managed environment, it's a lot easier to enumerate than otherwise. For managed environments, you can utilize the Graph API. And if you've ever tried to authenticate with Microsoft 365 in a managed environment, you submit your email, and if it's valid, you go to the password field. If it's an invalid email, then you get an error message, right? So basically what you're doing is you're just keying off that error message using that API to see if that account's valid in that environment or not.
Yep. Good. So I know I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but when we talk about discovering tenants, do you use AAD internals? Do you use another tool? What's kind of your process and kind of workflow for discovering tenants and kind of validating those?
Yeah, so I think
Tool-wise.
AAD internals is the main source. I know people primarily know that as an internal tool. However, it's also useful as an external tool because that does divulge a lot of information. AAD internals will give you associated domains related to that organization's tenant. In addition to that, it'll tell you if it's a managed or federated tenant. And so that kind of keys you in on what you need to do to enumerate and validate those accounts. So AD internals is very pivotal for determining next steps and kind of opening up that attack surface, be a little bit wider.
Yep. Awesome. So we've enumerated tenants, right? Let's walk through kind of a typical strategy here. You've enumerated tenants, right? You've discovered, or maybe you haven't discovered accounts yet. You kind of, maybe we should talk about that, right? It's like, where do you discover emails and usernames, right? Because you can have word lists. There's services you can use that I know that you use, Tyler, but part of enumerating Microsoft 365 is figuring out the actual names, right? You can find that various different ways. So I'm curious, how do you find those names and those employees and things like that? And then how do you find those emails?
Yeah, so the first goal before you're going to use, tools to brute force for names, which I'll cover in a minute, you first want to know email format. And so we have tools that we implement like phonebook.cz, and that's key for knowing what the email format of the organization is. And so generally, phonebook.cz will give you a couple different email formats, but there will be one that's predominantly used and stands out. And so that's the one that we key off of. Using that information, we'll use a tool that we recently implemented called OneDrive Enum. This tool gets a SharePoint URI specific to the organization. And based off the email format, you'll create a permutation of users in a word list. So say the organization's first initial last name, we'll create a word list based off that format. And it just sends a brute force basically to SharePoint, that URI. And if the response is either a 401 or a 403, you know that that's a valid user in that environment. And so typically what we see is this technique spiders and enumerates a lot more emails than we get from our other OSINT techniques. So for mid-sized organizations, we typically get anywhere from 400 to 1,000 emails using this. So it's super, super key for providing a larger scope that we can use to password spray.
Yeah. And OneDrive Enum is really awesome. There was a lot of research that was done recently by NYX Geek, who's the creator of that tool. So shout out to him for creating it and doing the research behind the scenes. I know this was something that, so he works at Trusted Sec, and I know he which is kind of funny that I'm wearing this shirt today, was not planned. But he did a lot of research and kind of disclosed this to Microsoft, I think, early on before it was released, and did a Black Hat talk, I believe, on it, things like that. But great tool. It's also interesting because, and which I think you'll hit on a minute, is like there's no way to there's no good way to identify or capture that that's happening, right?
Right. Yeah. So there's no rate limiting that you can implement to prevent somebody from sending thousands of attempts. In addition to that, there's not good logging around it. So there's nowhere where you can see if people are brute forcing for that endpoint in your SharePoint. Moreover than that, to fix this issue is a huge hassle, and it also impacts Microsoft services, because if you don't have that SharePoint URI for your users, say you share files in Teams regularly, you can no longer do that. That functionality breaks because those files are saved up to that URI. So, if an attacker has that and they know it's there, they still can't access the resources within it. However, they can still know that that user is 100% valid and that account exists in that environment.
Yeah, and that's a pretty powerful capability, right? Knowing that a user account exists and knowing that that is valid. And being able to enumerate that, especially in large organizations, with hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of users, having a validated list of users is really powerful. And there's implications there for password spraying, social engineering, a number of different things. That mailbox exists. That user exists in that environment.
Mm-hmm. Another thing, not as substantial as other information, but that code you get, whether it's 401 or 403, can actually tell the attacker whether or not you allow basic authentication in your environment. So that tag is actually very useful for, figuring out additional information as well, just based on that response code.
Yep. Yeah, that's super interesting. And going like what we said with OneDrive and Enum, there's no logs, apparently. There's no login attempted, right? And like you said, there's no rate limitings. It's like the perfect storm of enumeration. How do you describe kind of the risk? Because one of the kind of contraries to this is like, oh, it's just enumeration, right? Like you're not exploiting anything. It's just enumeration. Like, how bad is this? What would you say to people who are kind of thinking that, or kind of trying to think through the risk of this?
Well, if we're going off CVSS, right, this does cause some information disclosure, right? Because these are emails that we're not getting from other sources or have not been spidered on the internet. Right. This is a way to enumerate every single account in your environment, right? With enough time, an attacker could get every single one of your user accounts versus, just based off what's on the internet, you probably get maybe 30-40% of an organization, right?
Right.
So you get substantially more information from this. And it's also key in, attacks that come after the enumeration, such as password sprays and, just other credential attacks. So I'd say the risk here, you're looking at a medium risk because you can divulge every account in that environment.
Yep, for sure.
So I think that substantiates the risk pretty well.
Yeah, definitely. And this is something that I think the community itself is trying to, get Microsoft and other providers, right, to take more seriously, right, these enumeration type of attacks for sure. So what else? So we've discovered accounts. I think another thing that we wanted to mention is kind of endpoints, right? We have user accounts, right? We can spray Microsoft 365 services, and there's different endpoints for that, right, Tyler? But there's other endpoints potentially as well that we might be able to use those accounts against.
Right. So this typically revolves around on-prem Exchange. If you're still using on-prem Exchange, don't. But typically on-prem Exchange has what we refer to as NTLM endpoints that are exposed over HTTP, right? And so these endpoints we actually enumerate for whenever we find any host. So we have a subset of list of common NTLM endpoints that are known. I think it's around 50 endpoints. And what we'll do is we'll just run every host that we have to check for these endpoints. These NTLM endpoints, in addition to them not being as secure or having the same protections that your other authentication endpoints will have, such as MFA, these endpoints also divulge information such as your internal AD name scheme and various server information, such as its fully qualified domain name, and additional information like that. So those endpoints are another thing that we'd like to enumerate and look for.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of taking it the next step, right? Kind of this is the precursor to, the next series of this episode, which is initial access. So all of this is done, right, to try and get an initial access or to compromise accounts or to get access to things that we didn't have already. So what's the next step after this, right? Like we've discovered tenants, we've discovered accounts, we've enumerated the user accounts, we maybe have validated them with different things, we've validated those endpoints, kind of as foreshadowing to the next episode. What's kind of next in this line of like enumeration to kind of the next step?
Yeah, so it's going to be trying to get credential access, right? So that can be spraying the NTLM recon endpoints in addition to spraying, Microsoft 365's MSOL endpoint to try and gain initial access via password sprays to figure out, valid passwords for these accounts.
Yep. One thing we didn't mention yet, and this might only come into play with password spraying, I don't know because I'm curious, is conditional access. Does conditional access ever get in the way of like your enumeration and kind of discovery processes or workflows?
So conditional access won't affect OneDrive Enum. So
Right.
since
No
there's
login.
not an actual login attempt, conditional access does not apply there. And depending on how granular their conditional access policy is, it may or may not affect the password spray, right? So
Yep.
since we're proxying those requests and spraying from different regions, I think one of those is a Europe region. So if you do have, geofencing enabled as part of that conditional access, then it will block attempts from that endpoint. However, not the others. So depending on how granular that policy is, it can affect that password spray.
Yep. Gotcha. And what are some of the things that organizations, defenders, sysadmins, IT admins should know about enumeration in order to kind of defend against it, right? Obviously, it's not something that we can eliminate completely because there's emails on the internet. There's ways to enumerate accounts in emails with OneDrive Enum and various other tools. Mm-hmm. There's no way we're going to eliminate it completely, right?
Right.
But what's your advice for defenders on mitigating it and just being aware of the risks of it?
To be able to sleep better at night, it's really about account protections. So just assume that an attacker has all of your accounts in your environment. What do you do about it? You further secure those accounts. You force MFA on all your authentication endpoints. You enforce strong passwords, passphrases, things of that nature to further protect your users.
Yep. Yeah, because, if you validate all of these accounts, you spray all these accounts and you get a couple hits, maybe you're not able to log into Microsoft 365 because of conditional access or MFA, right? But if you have these NTLM endpoints, or you have, a VPN portal exposed, or you have Citrix or some sort of VDI, remote desktop gateway, something like that. You have SaaS applications. So to your point, Tyler, Microsoft 365, this whole enumeration thing, that's not the end goal, right? The end goal is compromise accounts, get access to environments, and those kinds of things. And that means, like you said, protecting those accounts, protecting those endpoints. I think we say it all the time. Like if you have something on the internet, like a management interface or something like that, it will be poked at, right? It will be scanned. It will be brute forced. I was just talking with a client just the other day. They were like, yeah, well, our built-in admin account, like our built-in like local domain admin account, right? The administrator account is getting locked out. Like it gets locked down every day. Like it's just getting brute forced for some reason. And my first question was like, do you have Citrix or some sort of like remote desktop, like VDI thing on the internet? They're like, oh yeah. And I'm like, okay, cool. Check the logs on that host. It's probably getting brute forced from there. Because I know from my perspective, when I set up a lab on the internet or like a VM or something that I'm testing with, which I do for like password spraying tools, right? I'll set up like an Exchange server on the internet. Within minutes, right, it's getting brute forced. Right. Like within minutes, it's getting scanned and, everything is trying to hit it. So if it's on the internet, it's going to be poked at. So you have to make sure that those accounts are secured, those endpoints are secured. You don't have legacy authentication and things like that. It's 2024. It's time to turn that stuff off.
And another note, if you are utilizing those NTLM endpoints, they are not MFA by default. So those natural protections that your other endpoints have are gone. So third-party implementations like Duo can secure those endpoints, but by default, those are going to be inherently more insecure. So I think doing an audit and knowing that you have them and knowing you have additional protections around them is key in securing those assets as well.
Yeah. So what else? Is there anything we missed on enumerating Microsoft 365 from an attack perspective?
I think that's all the techniques that we're currently implementing and using. There's only so much information you can enumerate and gather related to Microsoft 365 before you're just, kicking the dead horse, right? So, outside of those techniques, we kind of be burning time where we don't need to because, with this, we get a lot of key pivotal information and accounts that, we'll use for follow up subsequent attacks. So,
yeah, definitely. Yeah, and there are, of course, other tools. There's a lot of tools for spraying Microsoft 365, for enumerating. There's tools that we didn't mention in this episode that we have used before and prefer to use other tools, or we haven't used at all or very much. There's a lot of stuff out there. So if you're listening and you want to take a look at that stuff, the ones we mentioned so far were OneDrive Enum, AAD internals, so Azure AD internals. Unfortunately, they changed the name to Entra. NTLM Recon is another one. So those are just some of the ones we mentioned. So awesome. So that's our episode. Short and sweet, 25 minutes. I think that's pretty good. It's a good introduction to enumeration, Microsoft 365 attacks, like enumerating Microsoft 365. So stay tuned for the next episode in this series. We're going to be talking about initial access, and then we're going to be talking about post-exploitation of Microsoft 365 specifically. So we're doing a whole series on this. So we hope you guys enjoy this. Hope you got value from this episode. If you did, go follow us on LinkedIn, on YouTube, all the socials. You can go to our website at offsec.blog to see all the content that we post. And of course, go to securit360.com for the blog there. And if there's anything we can help you with, hit us up there. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll see you on the next one.